Hello and most welcome to H874. I just had a little nap here. I finally received my anti-snoring device. And I was lucky, I didn't have to pay the full amount. Generosity came knocking on the door. Still some. I will talk today while I'm waking up about the Matryoshkas and the return of the Matryoshkas. As you might remember, Matryoshkas are those Russian doll sets where there is a larger doll, and inside that larger doll you find a somewhat smaller doll, and under that one you find a somewhat smaller doll and a smaller doll and a smaller doll. The gestalt it gives is absolute separation between the different levels. The three aspects on that. The first one is that you can't see through the bigger one. It's opaque, intransparent. The second is there doesn't seem to be eye-wise any connection between layer 1 and layer 2 and layer 3. There's some thin air in between. So there is a compartmentalization going on. And the third point, if you try to stuff anything from the outside to the inside, it won't enter. And I think that might be the most important reason. Oddly enough, none of these three things are congruent with perception, and especially the last one, the impenetrable trait of matter, or any wall for that matter, is something that is created by two things. What we usually call a 3D projection, which not really is a 3D projection, but is the generally perceived reality coming from the Cartesian coordinates. It has a long tradition in the West, but it doesn't stem up to true. Space is not Euclidean as we normally think. It's non-Euclidean, and that means that there are no limiting borders. Everything is more or less round, and that doesn't allow for limits in the same way as we are used to. The second is quantum mechanics show that things do pass even through what we usually perceive as being massive walls. This idea of a stopping effect from the walls is not true to reality, even though we all perceive it to be that way. That I do not have a disagreement with. What I have a disagreement with is experience, and to compare that with what we know is real. Maybe this is actually a little bit of an attack of phenomenology of Husserl. His epoche, going to experience itself, doesn't hold with this anymore. I think that's very interesting. The more you go to experience, the more you will establish these shutting out borders. That is not reality. So phenomenology is not true to the scientific fact that there are no borders. Neither is it true to topology. And actually, every time you enter some sort of phenomenological discourse, you will worsen the case, because it's not our prejudice there are anything wrong with. It's not our opinions that are skewed. It's the actual experience, what we perceive. And it's exactly perception or experience that phenomenology goes down to. This was something that Martin Heidegger tried to adjust all his life, and an educated guess could be that that was his striving for dicere, but it never succeeded. He would have had to have paraconsistent logic to be able to do that. He did it without knowing it by crossing out. Crossing out means that something exists to the fullest, and it also have non-existence to the fullest. It's both empty and full at the same time. And this is, here I'm trying now to do a Rodolphe Gasset deconstruction myself. Yes, it's your lecturer. He wants to, into this episode 874, make his own deconstruction. This would be the third try on making my very own deconstruction. Let's see how it goes. There is another Matrushka. It's a Matrushka where everything is interconnected. This is a truer view of space. This is not how we experience. Let me exaggerately explain that. And in the interconnected Matrushka, or as Rapoport would have said, the interpenetrative Matrushka, there is a connection between each layer. It's also a connection between each minute area of space. Doesn't matter how small it is. And this means I am trying out to make a deconstruction of levels, but also of partitions. The partitions between the different size-wise arranged Matrushkas in the Matrushka doll. Also partitionings in the sense when you make an argument, you have a convoluted argument inside that argument, and that there is a distance in between those arguments, and you can have, so to speak, a pure sequencing. Well, there is an interconnectedness also there. Space in itself is interconnected. That's one of the features of space that experience do not support, but it's still true. And of course, this is connected to the Western amnesia, the forgetfulness that it used to be a bigger openness once upon a time. This flies in the face of the Western amnesia. And in the Western amnesia, we do have borders all over the place, partitionings. And I mentioned a few of them: inside, outside, after, before. Past is completely separate from the now, and therefore this fixation with now. Future is somewhere over there, not reachable, and actually normally perceived to be a cause of nuisance these days. These levels, these partitionings, are not to be found within reality. Therefore, they are actually made by something I call unknowingness, lack of knowledge, not something that is knowable. And to be able to sort of penetrate these partitionings, you need to expand knowingness. Let knowingness go into the Matrushka. or whatever the area of inquiry is at the moment. All areas of inquiry can actually be opened up this way. It's not only the Matrushka. Matrushka is actually more of a gestalt to show what you can do, what are the possibilities. One could start with the deconstruction to see that the lower levels or the more interior levels of the Matrushka are marginalized, and the thing you perceive on the outside seemingly is more important than the inside. And I think this is very recognizable from things we discussed before. We have a tendency for two-dimensionality, and we also have a tendency to perceive reality as sheer surface. For most of us, the objects, as long as we perceive them, are just the surfaces on the objects. We do not regularly let knowingness penetrate deep into the objects. They are sort of shut. So we only get not even skin deep into the objects, and that's a shame, because that rids a lot of what would be experienced to come to the fore. How do I know that? Well, we can give some examples. In pre-modern era, the inside of things were as much as important than the outside or the surface. Actually, the use of a thing, which is its inside, took a predominant role, of course, because if something is something for us, it's because we use it. No longer do we use things in the same way. We have loads and loads of stuff around us that are never being used. And that makes it easier to fall into the trap to think of objects rather, existing independently of our wants, our intentions, or us even, what we do with them. Because objects won't be objects until we use them. And now a sort of an inflation has appeared. We do have the objects, but they don't mean anything to us. And even the objects that make up our cells, the atoms or molecules, they are complete strangers and distance to us. Knowledge needs to come into this sectionality to shed its illuminating light on what are the petitionings. And once you started to do that, two things will emerge rather quickly. One is there is a deepening of the Matrushka. You go directly into it. You will get a better feel that there is an insight to the Matrushka. The second thing is that once you go into the depth of what the thing is, you will start to realize, and it is something for me. It becomes almost like a friend. And this is what Heidegger usually call care or Sorge. You care about the things once more. And that this caring is what I was looking for before when I said there are something for you, they are something for you. You interact with them. They're not distant anymore. You actually do them. And this extra distancing of not being in the world seem weirder and weirder, and you start realizing that actually takes me away from the world and what I have around me. So it's actually a shame to do it. In the very Gestalten Matryoshka, with its different levels, somewhere is interconnectedness shoved out of the picture. It seemed to disappear, and I would say that's a construct of our modern days of taking everything at a superficial level, and that superficiality becomes partitioning, and oddly enough the partitioning enters into the depth of a thing. And this is most clearly illustrated with the Matryoshka, but it goes for all things. The depth of a thing is its use, and that is not so easy as it sounds. Once you start really delving into this, you start understanding everything is something for me, and all of a sudden everything changes character. They become less localized in the world. They become less distance to you and what you are, and they start to live once more. They get shiny. You treat them with kindness. No longer will you mistreat the things around you, because they are part of your living world, and the living world is what you are partly as well. And this is why these things are so immensely important. Of course, this has also to do with presencing. If you think of a singular, very sharp moment that is so thin nothing hardly can enter, this automatically shuts out the possibility for depth in the object, and for that matter depth in the subject. That happens simultaneously. Lack of depth for the objects is also lack of depth for the subject. It goes hand in hand. The inner part, the ones not perceived directly by immediacy of presencing, or the now feeling, or mindfulness, or whatever you call it, is absent. And it's absent in the way that you can't see it right now. Apparently, you're supposed not to realize it's inside anymore, and you can't touch it because there is what you think an impenetrable wall between the thing you want to touch and the outer surface, the biggest Matryoshka doll that contains them all. And the marginalization goes to the ones inside, because those you can't see. And this is one of those things that's so hard to challenge. But for me it was very helpful. Think how it used to be. It cannot be any chance in hell that people perceive the object as just surfaces. It doesn't make any sense whatsoever, because things were used in that time. They could never ever be looked in that weird way. I look at an object, I create a surface. There is no need for that. And I also trust that people were a lot more active in those days, and that makes for a completely different perception. And to say that that thing is the same thing is just a nonsensical term. How do you define the same thing? Is anything the same thing in that manner? I doubt it, to be honest. Seriously doubt it. Rather than this divide, there is a cohabitation. One of the dolls is of course more outside than the other, but it doesn't have to mean that the working order should always start with the biggest one. It can start from any place, and it's a synchronistic happening, where things seem to be threaded in the same way, as to make a singular point somewhere in the future where we take care of something or the subject. This happened only yesterday for my sake. Meeting was called together and it was rather unexpected. I had time to do it during the afternoon, but it was most interesting. It was very rewarding. I don't think it would be unfair to talk about parallel existences when we talk about the Matryoshka, and that there is a certain parallelity here where you have many layers working at the same time and interpenetrating each other, instead of the more regular idea that the levels are completely separated, had nothing to do with each other, and that the inner workings of each layer is somewhat consistent or coherent. Where, as a matter of fact, a lot of people I know, they have a higher factor, might have several higher factors than swimming. So you can look at your own procedure and you can sort of get, I should take it easy today or something like that. I can also term this partitioning, shutting out of space. Space needs its wide expansion to be working to the fullest, and we also need to be in this presencing where many levels sorry presencing together, parallelism. I could also term this mutualism, that the borders are crossed over constantly and the two defining lines are not that sharp, and there is an exchange between the levels. And this goes for mathematics. This is constructive mathematics, instead of having the perceived law of the excluded middle bringing everything together. Instead, you have something that is more closer to reality. You have contradictions and you have a singular truth as well. You have a result, or you have the end of the syllogism. The summa. Now this is where deconstruction becomes incredibly interesting, because when we go down to perception, experience, what we actually have in front of us and live in, things becomes very, very important. These are things that decide so much in our reality, whereas words or ideologies only work sort of in a vacuum. Doesn't really influence our life, doesn't really illuminate our days, our walking days, our living days. This mutuality is also, of course, similar to the inclusiveness you find in paraconsistent logic, where two negations can exist at the same time, or a positive thing can exist at the same time as a negative thing, and so forth. You have all the corners of the Chatuskoti and then yet more. this is actually allowed in space, and we know that. But one of the reasons this is not generally recognized is it takes some sort of image to understand it. It cannot be understood merely by words, because your experience will be the thing, just like the phenomenologist, you will constantly go back to, and that experience will most likely confirm what you earlier experienced. One can, so to speak, one could actually speculate, why is it so? My take on it is that we are so used to it, it has entered our language, and once you get the realization this is how it could be, you sort of get stuck into that, and you project that idea to reality before it happens. Wow, that is rather a hefty argument coming from me. Why? What do I mean? Do I have any proof? Well, I do actually. Quantum mechanics is the proof for that. That shows that classical physics projects a causality to the outer world. That causality is not part of the real world. Quantum mechanical causation is something entirely different, and it takes the subject into calculation, because it's only the subject that can decide what something is going to be. And this of course also makes our position in the world much more important. We actually construct the world, and that is also the absolute demand for the world to be shared by others. Ursäkta, äter lite grann för pigna upp. Non-Euclidean mathematics turned up in the mid-19th century. Still to this very day, that's the most common perception. That is the mathematics, or the idea, the typology of space that were before the advent of non-Euclidean space. That's the space that people experience. And it's a sort of space that has limits, it has borders, it has definite ends, whereas in Euclidean space everything is circular, striving back to its original position. And since Euclidean space is a possibility, it's also sort of a necessity. It is not something to be ignored, because we already know that the world is mainly non-Euclidean. Although for some reason our experience seems to be cast in a format that is Euclidean. And that is affecting what's happening before it's even happened. It's a sort of having a preconception, even though that is pre-conceptual, but that is also a deciding conception. So the massiveness, you could say, is what I'm questioning here. The massiveness and the tendency for matter to be completely impenetrable, and massive borders that keep distances in between. They are very hard to question, but you need to put some effort to do that. And I can assure you, you will be well awarded, because there is a liberation in doing that. You feel much less crowded, and you open up physically, and you find your balance. it's not an exaggeration, I would say, to say that balance is not even a possibility in classical physics, because you are constantly being thrown out of balance by having a eye somewhere situated in this origo system, and you track or check your own advances in that system, whatever you do. That's a way of shutting off knowledge and making knowledge secular and also distant. Whereas the intimate realization of our interconnectedness with reality instead strengthens us and makes us whole once more. Not that we have to admit fault or having to buy egg cups or something of that sort. It's not something that is necessary. So, well, some things could actually go along. Maybe that's an egg knife, I don't know. Also time, and time is important here because where does it all start? It starts with the idea of an eternal nowness. Eternal means that this instance is the whole universe and the whole world, and its self-identity. It's this moment and it's identical to itself. And already there it goes completely haywire. It's in the interpretation of Plato that things goes wrong, and that is actually caused by our general perception of philosophy. Might I say it's a squirted way, but it's shared among everyone. You can look at children portraits, books, adult portraits, whatever. It doesn't make any difference whether it's a drawing. She still has that height. Apparently I can't be quiet. Susan Roble dwelled into the subject of fractality. It's very interesting. Fractal time shows that time is nothing like the time we usually perceive to be, almost like space itself. Not a big surprise because we take our gestalt from space to build time, so that is hardly a big surprise. But once you put in fractality, you start to understand these shore walls between the future, past and present are not that shore anymore, and they can actually be looked through. So you can open them up until they become transparent, and you can stick with that idea in your head at the same time as you think you are expanding in all directions. That's actually a very, very good training thing to do. And of course, in the fractality, we can store loads of much more information than we normally can. The fractality doesn't have any limits to it. The constant iterations and the convoluted way they work and how they descend and incend, if you like, the different levels against each other. Så vi får sätta oss i parken då. Well, I say thank you very much. I think I'm going to have another nap. Say very sorry for my sleepiness. See you soon. Good afternoon and bye bye.